Hey Paul, welcome back.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
So we are on the third episode now, and in the first one we talked a bit about why men's work and how we got onto the path of men's work.
Mhm.
And then in the second episode, we expanded the idea of what is it we're trying to do in the space of men's work, and we connected it to spirituality, or we played a bit with both the contrast and the unity of the masculine and the feminine, right?
Mhm.
Um, and we sort of finished off the last talk alluding to archetypes and a little bit around rites of passage.
Mhm.
And I've been studying archetypes a bit, and I'm have some familiarity with Jung's work on that.
Mhm.
And then there are some other work. I'm thinking about Gillette and Moore, who wrote King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, which is
Mhm.
to some degree kind of a holy book in the men's movement, I've understood, right?
I think in the mythopoetic men's movement, then
Yeah,
that's seen as one of the foundational texts,
yeah,
alongside with a guy called David Data,
yeah, right.
and his work, and then Robert Bly is like the grandfather with Iron John.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, I
Aaron
think.
John is standing in the bookshelf behind me here, actually,
Uh-huh. Okay.
along with the other books.
Uh-huh.
So I thought we'd spend some time in this episode to unpack archetypes a bit more.
Mhm.
You know, what is it? Where does it come from? Why is it important? And then get practical. How do
Mhm.
you see this is helpful for the work you do with men?
Mhm.
Does it sound good?
That sounds great. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I think archetypes have been around for a very, very long time as a way of seeing it. And maybe at the most basic level, one could say it, for definition, it's just an abstraction of human behavior.
Mm.
Specific types of human behavior that are abstracted out from the personal level. Like we all kind of know who Michael Jordan is, or at least most of us do, and we kind of have some idea of at least some of the qualities of Michael Jordan, but he's still a person.
Yeah.
But if I start saying, like, superstar basketball player, then that's a movement towards this archetypical level, because it's not connected to a specific person, although it draws on all of the people who have kind of fulfilled that category somehow. And
Mm.
so and the idea, we also sometimes use a type. A type is kind of like, and then the archetype, and archa comes from the Greek, which means kind of like higher, or I think, something transcendent. So an archetype is like the higher levels of abstraction
Okay.
of different types, I guess. And it's a very, very old idea. I think you actually know more about where some of the roots of it are than I do, actually.
I think the sort of the immediate roots, or the name that quickly comes to mind when you talk about archetypes in the West, at least, is Jung, of course, Carl Jung and his work. But he was inspired by more ancient work. You can find the idea of archetypes in the Veda, and in the Bible, and everything in between. So as you say, for a lot of people, it's a helpful way of thinking about personality traits and the different flavors of how to go about life.
Yeah. Yeah. And for a lot of people, when they first hear about these ideas kind of in a modern context, then a lot of them, their response is like, well, I don't really know much about archetypes. I don't really understand them that much. And my response is, actually you do. You might just not realize it. But
Yeah.
I think the only person who could make that claim is maybe someone who's autistic or something like that. That's possible that they would have a hard time recognizing archetypes. But I think it's basically all stories and narratives and movies build on archetypes, and meaning. Our way of understanding meaning in life is very much through this archetypical level of existence. And so we find different ways. I think a very simple way of looking at it is, the way we recognize different different archetypes through symbols and the meanings that we attach to that.
Yeah.
And so, simple way, if you take, for example, the king archetype. The king, that's an archetype, it's a common one. Then, if I draw a little stick figure man with a crown on his head, then everybody thinks, oh, king. So we recognize that, even though it's a very, very simple drawing, right? That's a simple way of illustrating it, but we attach so much to a king. So we all kind of have an idea of, for example, what is kingly behavior and what would be unkingly behavior as well. And we could see that, and we have different understandings of what kings stand for and what they do as well. And so it's, in some ways, this is just pattern recognition, you could call it, but this, again, going back to our previous talk, it plugs into a far more complex and deeper understanding of what reality is, down on this kind of immaterial substrate of reality, in that we have our sense making as human beings, and it can't be always explained in a kind of materialistic, rational way.
Yeah. And you mentioned the king there, which is inspired by the work of Gillette and Moore, right? I mean, it exists before, but I think in the men's movement, I see that there's a lot of talk about this king, warrior, magician, lover. Mm-hmm. And if you look back at Jung, he actually had 12 archetypes, but in 4 categories, which then Gillette and Moore sort of nicely summarized and interpreted for this book, King, Warrior, Magician, Lover.
Yeah.
So I think it would be helpful to get a little bit of an overview of the spectrum of archetypes. And I don't know if you want to use the Moore Gillette framework of these 4, or if you prefer any other framework for that.
I think that we will use the Gillette and Moore framework of King, Warrior, Magician, and Lover, because it's been very widely used, especially by the mythopoetic men's movement. I think we'll also use other archetypes as well to dive into those understandings. In my view, there are many different taxonomies, and the taxonomies are useful to use. But if I start using them as seeing all of my life and all of existence through just this one framework, then it's probably not, it's going to lead me to a certain level, and then I think the learning will stop at some point. So I think it's important not to get too caught up in specific ways of seeing it. I know a lot of men who get a lot of value from identifying their own primary archetype and secondary archetype, and working in a concentrated way with that. But in some ways, I think each of us embody all the archetypes to different degrees, and then each archetype has a shadow kind of version, or an immature version, and a mature kind of fulfilled version as well that it has. So we can really look at that. So I mean, King, Warrior, Magician, Lover is one that really gives men a good understanding of the wholeness of masculinity in some ways. We've also really looked at aspects of mind, body, and spirit reflected in the warrior, priest, and merchant archetypes. And then most recently, we've been exploring a lot more modern archetypes, especially the engineer, the architect, and the artist have been really, really useful for us. And the last one that I think is super interesting to look into is just the hero archetype. What is it that a hero does or is about? And how do we recognize a hero for what qualities we put into that?
So that makes me think, because the idea of archetypes, as you said, has a very, very long tradition. And then if we look at Jung's original work, it was 12 archetypes. And then now you're moving into introducing other archetypes as well. And I fully support that idea, because I think we need to be clear that all models are wrong, but models are helpful for a conversation, because it's easier for us to relate to how the other person thinks. And we also know that humans hasn't evolved much in the last couple of thousand years. So why do you find it valuable to introduce new archetypes and to introduce modern names such as the engineer, the architect?
I think you put it in a very good way, that models are useful and good, but they'll always fall short of reality. So we're really experimenting. I think just taking on an archetypical view helps us to connect to something older and deeper than ourselves, and some idea of human nature and the way that we work as human beings, which connects us back to other things. But we also need to be, as human consciousness is increasingly moving. I spend probably majority of my time when I'm at work, for certainly not in the material world, but in a virtual world. And you and me, I would say we have a pretty deep friendship by now, and we really know each other incredibly well. And I've had conversations with you that I haven't had with people that I've known for a very long time, but we've never met in real life yet.
It's weird.
Looking forward to it happening. But so that is a little strange, but that's just the new reality, and I think that's it's going to be increasingly like this, and so we do need to be bringing in new inputs that are challenging our ways of thinking of archetypes. But then I also want to say one of the most important aspects here is that we're not just thinking about archetypes, because there's a tendency for us to make this a very cognitive process. And in my experience, one can read some Jung, and one can have some deep insights about one's own life, but the archetypes really step into their value and power through experience.
Yeah.
And so that's, yeah, that's where the real value comes from.
And when you say experience, that makes me think of how we closed the last talk, because we mentioned rites of passage.
Yeah.
When we were talking about sort of the sons and the fathers, and being deprived of fathers, and to a large degree now rejecting fathers in the plural, not just the biological father.
Yeah.
So how does rites of passage play into this around archetypes and men's work?
Yeah. So I think I'm very inspired by a guy called Arne Rubinstein from Australia. He's, I would say, one of the world's leading experts these days on rites of passages. He is very inspired by a Frenchman, I can't remember the name now, who basically traveled around the world and studied primitive cultures and found that every single one of them are using rites of passage to initiate people from one stage of life into the next stage of life. And there's been a special focus of boys to men. And so we have these tribes out on Pacific Islands that are jumping off high towers with roots or stuff tied around their necks, or ropes around their, not around their necks, sorry, around their ankles that stop them just before they hit the ground. And, you know, Amazonian tribes that have these like poisonous ants that they have inside gloves, and they put them in their hands, and then they do a dance while these ants are, you know, biting them.
How is this translated to 2020?
yeah 2020. So basically, and also in our society as well, we've had rites of passages, but the idea is that they've kind of lost their significance. They've become very light societal cultural traditions, but there's not an awareness of the depth of meaning in our rites of passage anymore. So they've kind of become irrelevant. And in many ways, especially in very secular Northern Europe, then we're still using Christian rites of passages such as confirmation, but there's not actually a belief in the underlying substrates of what that tradition represents. And so it's kind of just done in a very superficial, immaterial way, or let's say it's most kids, it's more about the gifts that they get when they get confirmed than anything else. And for the parents as well, it's more like, all kinds of other considerations. And there isn't this, so yeah, I mean, a rites of passage holds a number of specific elements. But I think at a very foundational level, what a rite of passage is it's a physical event that's held at a specific place and time with a specific group of people who are delineated. And so you call that a container. And inside that container, there's a process that happens where everybody kind of steps into the container. And for that period of time that the rites of passage happens, then there's some kind of transformational process that happens there. So we go in there and we let go of who we are. We allow our egos to disintegrate to a certain extent. And Arne always uses the illustration of a caterpillar turning into a moth. So, you know, what the caterpillar is somehow turns into mush in some ways. And we call that liminal space. And liminal space is that space where you're fully present and aware and learning the most you possibly can, because you're in interaction with other people, or you're in a state of flow, or whatever it is. And so there's this disintegration that happens, and we learn something new there, and there's a new story that's told there. And by doing that, then, you know, information is transmitted, stories are shared, and something new is formed, and then we then kind of wrap up the ceremony, the ritual of the rite of passage, and we're able to take that with us into our new life. But we're not the same as we were before. We're actually changed. We're somebody new.
Transformed.
We're transformed. And so that's what a rites of passage is about, really, is that transformational process that we can do in a regular way by using specific tools and a specific structure. But there has to be this awareness that what we're doing actually is plugging into a deeper level of existence. So it's sacred. A rite of passage is sacred, and needs to be that understanding. And that's, I think, what's been lost, especially here in the West, is that the sacredness of baptisms and confirmations and marriages, because these are all rites of passages. What do you call it? Not burials. I'm trying to translate directly from Danish. When someone dies, a funeral. Funerals are all rites of passages, right? So funerals, I think we still get the sacredness of it, but some of the other ones are more just social affairs.
Yeah. And it also makes me think, going back a bit to the talk in the previous episode, because the way you describe rites of passage now, it's an event. And you may have a couple of those events through life in the different phases that you pass through, right? But I'm also thinking, isn't there also sort of the process type of rites of passage in the constant or continual interaction with elders, or fathers in plural? I mean, growing up as a boy with a father and taking part in the way he goes about life and how he interacts with other men. There's a rites of passage as well, sort of learning by doing in the everyday life, right? Like I was, by my father's side in his workshop and learning how to do things there. And, when he was out sailing and talking to the other sailors and seeing that interaction and learning from that. So where I'm going with this is that if we look at society today with a lot of broken homes and a lot of absent fathers, that's, shall we call it, the micro rites of passages in everyday life, is not present to the same degree anymore. And even if there is a father, the father is away in the office pursuing a career, rather than passing on what it means to be a man to the son.
Yeah.
So I guess this, for the formalized event like rites of passage, has a very important role to fill now, because we miss a lot of this continual micro rites of passages.
Yeah, I mean, I think both are vital. So the idea of rites of passages builds on an understanding that human growth often does come incrementally, as you talk about, but it's also possible to, in a structured way, to take a step together as a group of people. And so, many times, and that's a very powerful tool to use. So and especially for the big transitions in life, then it's very valuable and good to formally take a step together from one stage of life to the next stage of life. And so, today many people will kind of, marriage has kind of become unpopular, and so people will, become girlfriend, boyfriend, and move in together, but still be having their own place, and then really move in properly together, and then slowly get a child together. And at some point they say, well, yeah, we're partners, we're life partners actually, but there wasn't a single point in time. And I don't want to criticize that model necessarily, but I think statistics show that people who do make that firm commitment are more likely to stay together, and so it seems to be a more stable approach. So obviously there's, people decide what they want to do, but having taking a step is a reliable way of plugging into that substrate, I would say, at least.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know about the data on that thing about the formal contract of marriage versus just living together. But what I'm thinking about, if we go back to men's work, I guess the last institutionalized rites of passage was military service. But that's also disappeared in other countries, as countries have moved to either professional armies or have abandoned the whole sort of public military service as a whole. And when you work with men, can you see a difference in the men that's been through military service versus have not, in terms of how they integrate masculinity or integrate their role as a man?
Absolutely, yeah. I think I'm not saying that there's never a man who hasn't gone to military service who doesn't have discipline and loyalty and a deeper understanding of brotherhood. And also, I think one of the things when you go into military training is that you're trained to deal with situations where decisions can be the cause of life or death, basically. You're trained to deal with life and death situations. So it's incredibly important that you are extremely precise in your communication, that you are very honest, and that there's a high degree of discipline. So if you say you're going to do something, you got to do it. And there's no kind of like, oh, well, that's okay kind of thing, So it's a very, very disciplined, and I would call masculine environment. And obviously what masculinity has been formed through the need for militaries, because human society has been violent, and so people have warred against each other, and so the humans that have survived the best have been the ones who have been best at organizing disciplined, structured military systems that have been also not only the most disciplined and structured, but also the most creative and powerful and whatever it is, the most, be able to think most strategically or whatever it is, right? So there's many aspects of this. So great military generals have been incredibly powerful thinkers. They've been very creative human beings who've been very strategic, and that's been something that's driven human society onwards, actually. And so, up until recently, when two cultures met each other, then the only real solution was to war with each other. And the most powerful, the one who outcompeted the other one with war, they're the ones who then dominated. And so people talk about like, oh, we're exploiting Africa and how terrible that is. And yeah, that's terrible to exploit Africa. But it's very, very recent, these ideas. So we're still getting used to it. Be kind to human beings. We're trying to learn this thing of like working with other people and seeing the good in them instead of just dominating, because that's been an approach that's been very widespread and the natural human reaction. And you see it not just in ancient history and anthropology studies and whatever, but you see it in the primary school as well. If you don't have any adult supervision to provide a guidelines or framework for kids, then at least there's a high risk that it descends into conflict. And who wins that conflict? Well, the one many different people. I guess there's different views on that as well, right? I mean, I've read The Lord of the Flies when I was in school. I'm not as pessimistic about human nature as that is, but I think it's a risk, at least.
And also, if we connect it back to Gillette and Moore and the king, magician, the warrior, and the lover. The warrior and the lover are on the same. They are polarities on the same axis, right? So the warrior doesn't function well if it's purely warrior. It must have the lover aspect as well. And I think there's a quote somewhere saying that don't give a man a sword until he can dance. So it's this discipline, the ability to perform violence, combined with the integration of the beauty of life and the love and the dance and the music and the art. And when that meets in the middle, then you have a powerful balance between the two, which we shouldn't forget, because we tend to talk about men and violence a lot. But there's definitely other aspects as well that we need to learn to integrate.
Yeah, so I think you and me, we need to dive into these individual archetypes and talk about each of them by themselves. But I think Gillette and Moore did a great job of creating a system that is a very, very useful heuristic for understanding men's personality and the different aspects of it, and for helping men to see how you can't just do this. It's good if you're good at what, obviously most people are stronger in some areas and weaker in others. The Myers-Briggs system uses Jung's 12 archetypes to kind of see, well, what type are you? and that's good and useful as well. But yeah, I think the idea of balance is core to see yourself as a holistic human being.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the Gillette Moore model, it's painted as two axes, right? With king on the top and magician as the polarity on the other side. You have warrior and you have lover. And in my understanding of it, in the work I've done with men around this, the problems arise when you're out on the edges of this model. And it's all about pulling in and balance yourself in the center. So you have similar access to all the four different polarities.
Yeah, and I see that, and then the way I've actually been working, and again, that's why we have different approaches here, but I really see the king as a kind of meta archetype for the three others. And so the king is the one who has integrated the warrior, the magician, and the lover. If you look at King Arthur, for example, then he had all of those qualities embodied in one place. And what's unique about the king is that he, the good king is not the tyrannical dominator of his people, but he's the servant of his people, actually. So everything he does is a sacrifice of himself. He's not looking after his own interests, but he's looking, well, what can I be doing to serve my people? And when he does that well, then he has to obviously have integrated, the warrior, the magician, and the lover as well to be able to pull everything together to the higher good.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then you have the undeveloped king, as you said, maybe the tyrant or the king riding on shadow sides, the childish variations of it, right? So, but this is a topic we could spend hours on. So I think we should maybe save that for the next episode and start diving into some of these archetypes.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah. So good. Yeah, are we going to go for warrior first? I think that sounds like, I think that's a good place to start, isn't it? Certainly one that I think a lot of men coming into men's work often have repressed the most, or do not understand the most, or are incredibly enthusiastic about sometimes as well.
Okay.
So there's some energy there, I think. So maybe we can start looking at the warrior, if that makes sense.
I'll take your guidance there. Let's dive into warrior then in the next talk.
Great.
Sounds good. Thank you, Paul. Very good talk.
Thanks for listening. My name is Paul, and I'm the co-founder of Maniphesto. We're an umbrella organization for people who share our vision of renewing and restoring man. So we run online men's groups, a facilitated training program, and the European Men's Gathering. And to succeed with our mission, we need people like you to engage. So if you enjoyed this, then please subscribe here or check out our website to join our core community.